Hello, and welcome to our study regarding the branch of psychology known as social psychology. We're going to start off with a couple of questions here. And the questions are, what do social psychologists study? And how old is the discipline of social psychology? So why was World War II so important in the development of social psychology in the United States? And what are the most important organizing concepts and perspectives in social psychology? So going forward, we are going to answer all these questions. First and foremost, what is social psychology? It focuses on the social dynamics of everyday living, how we interact with other human beings. We want to understand and explain how our thoughts, feelings, and behavior are influenced by the actual, implied, or imagined presence of others. So the primary researcher in regard to social psychology was Allport. And Allport said, well, my thoughts are affected by the actual presence of others. Look at this example here. All of these students are looking at me. I hope I can remember what comes next. Expanding a little bit further about Allport. He said, our feelings are affected by the imagined presence of others. That just means, what we are imagining, that other people are watching us and looking at our behavior and then passing judgments. Another example from Allport's definition, he says that our behavior is affected by the implied presence of others. So most people taking social psychology at first, they think, well, social psych, it just is common sense. So is it mere common sense? Well, according to this slide, social psychology is more than mere common sense. Okay, so the examples here I show that sometimes what everyone knows, in regard to common sense is pretty accurate, but sometimes it isn't. Just because there's more people that are thinking something, that doesn't mean that it's true. So you really can't tell the difference relying on common sense. We have to use what is called the scientific method to find the most reliable rules about human thought, emotion, and behavior. So is this true or false? If someone makes the claim and they say, you can make a person behave the way you expect that person to behave, well, that is true. That is called the self-fulfilling prophecy. So what is the self-fulfilling prophecy? Well, there are steps involved in that process, and that's when the person perceiving someone's behavior forms an impression of the target person. Step 2, the person that perceives acts toward the target consistent with the first impression. And then the third step is the target person's behavior changes to correspond to the perceiver's actions. Skipping forward here. So how about psychology and sociology? Well, both fields are interested in social behavior, but how are they related and how are they different? Well, psychology focuses on individuals, their thought processes, their emotions, and their behaviors. But sociology focuses on group level variables, like the status of the group, how the group normally behaves, that is norms, as well as social roles played by the group. So we'll start off by talking about the history of social psychology, and that began with somebody in the late 1800s. His name was Wilhelm Wundt. So Wilhelm Wundt was the founder of psychology, and he was responsible for two branches of psychology, the physiological component and the social component. And still in the 1800s, a person named Norman Triplett conducted the first social psychological experiment in 1895. Going forward, if you find this to be interesting and you want to conduct research, feel free to pause the slide here and look this up. So, talking about the history of social psychology, well, after World War II, research sought answers to the problems of the day. And so Theodore Adorno and Stanley Milgram had influential research programs searching to explain certain atrocities. Down at the bottom of this slide, you see Leon Festinger developed the theory of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance means, well, we might feel something inside, but somebody else might be explaining something and we just can't agree with that. We can't put that together in our mind. That is cognitive dissonance. So those two things here, following that, and reintegration of affective and motivational processes occurred. So motivational and affective. That information, you see at the bottom here, it said that links with related disciplines. So going forward here, let's carry on. So in social psychology, only 40% of the studies that have been conducted They tend to replicate. And why is that? Well, that's because it might not be universally acceptable, but it might be applicable to one individual at a time. So talking about certain individuals, we're talking about the self and social being developed in interaction with others, social being, and that also at the bottom of the slide we see it says the self has self-awareness, recognizing that self is separate from others, saying that you are a unique individual. Okay, elaborating a little bit further about the self, there is what's called self-serving bias and taking credit for our success. On the other hand, though, the self-serving bias, it's not only regarding people taking credit for their success, but blaming others if we experience failure. So we're going to talk about the two ways of thinking. So social thinking can be is when we are deliberate, we are consciously available, careful, and slow. It requires effort, and cognitive resources. But social thinking, can be automatic. That means it happens automatically. We don't choose to engage in that type of thinking. Skipping forward, there are two key social belief systems in regard to social behavior. There's what's called individualism, taking care of ourselves and immediate family only, pursuing one's own goals. And a person engaging in individualism doesn't like being influenced by groups. They say, I make my own decisions. Okay, on the other hand, there's what's called collectivism. And that's when the person takes care of others within their group, like their friends, their families, their peers, their colleagues, etc., etc. So about 70% of the world's population lives in societies with strong collectivist philosophy. Now, of course, there are 30% of the world's population that are individualists. Okay, here we are talking about evolutionary psychology. And that's remembering that individuals don't evolve, populations evolve over many generations. So we might be talking about the human species. A trait that may have been adaptive at one point might be persistent and becomes maladaptive as the environment changes. And that regards sex and gender, by the way. So gender means a psychological state of being either masculine or feminine, and that can be um, everything from one end to the other and everything in between. Okay, so how do psychologists, how do they know this information? Well, neuroscientists, when they have done brain scans on individuals, conducting certain types of brain scans like fMRIs or MRIs, CAT scans, etc., they were able to examine the relationship between social and neural processes. That refers to the neurons that are in the human brain. And that helps us, this research helps us to understand which cognitive processes are involved in specific behavior. And that just means when somebody behaves in a certain manner, well, maybe these neurons, this group of neurons, is working in their brain at that time. So all these structures here are shown. The brain regions in the frontal lobe, that is right, right behind the forehead area in the human brain. And the frontal lobe is involved in coordinating things like movement and higher mental processes, meaning making plans, our social skills, and thinking abstractly. Okay, so as psychology was evolving, um, there was a branch known as positive psychology, and the goals of positive psychology, basically, they strive to enrich human experience and maximize human functioning. It includes things like optimism, creativity, and morality. And that was the result of as the field of psychology was evolving, certain psychologists, they said, hey, we need to give more credit to human beings. They make their own decisions. They they're optimistic. They're creative. They're moral, etc., etc. So there's a few questions here. I'm skipping forward here. When we are thinking about sociology and neurology or the study of the human brain, so how might each of these disciplines better inform our understanding of how the individual fits into the larger social system? So feel free to pause this slide and think about this. Another question, what kind of evidence would it take for you to overrule your own common sense? So what kind of evidence would it take for you to say, well, I always thought this was truth, but now I'm starting to think, I'm starting to sort of ponder this, and I'm thinking I might have been on the wrong track at that time. Okay, skipping this slide here. Feel free to pause this video though and look at the question. So this question here at the top of the slide, it says, without using introspection, that means looking at yourself, how would you attempt to demonstrate that there's a such thing as a quote unquote self? Okay, so we're going to end this video by just sort of summarizing everything we talked about. So social psychology can be defined as an attempt to understand and explain how the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So that's closely related to what we call the biopsychosocial model, the biological, psychological, and social component of our thoughts and behaviors. And so everything we've been talking about, research psychologists have found that it's more than just common sense. Okay, so social psychologists, they studied how social reality is created, such as the self-fulfilling prophecy. That's one example. And the self-fulfilling prophecy describes how others' expectations about a person, a group, or a situation can actually lead to the fulfillment of those expectations. Okay, so let's take a look at the psychological component of social psychology. That focuses on individuals and how they respond to social stimuli. That's information from the environment and interacting with others. So a quick reminder, the psychological component is focusing on an individual, but the sociological component down below here, it says focuses on larger groups or societies. So social psychology, that field is a fairly young science. It's only about 150 years old. And it began with the pioneering work of Wilhelm Wundt. And then somebody named Triplett, they started conducting their first social psychological experiments in the 1800s. And social psychology was greatly affected by the Great Depression and racial issues in the U.S., how we interact with other human beings, and why that changes. So the field of social psychology is trying to become more inclusive and more diverse, become more inclusive and self-critical, leading to focusing on research ethics, Why is this ethical behavior acceptable? Why is this behavior not acceptable? A diverse membership. The key organization concepts or perspectives include the self and how it is shaped by and shapes its social environment. So thinking that can be both automatic and effortful. We need to keep that in mind. The human beings, they think both ways, both automatically and effortful. As we discussed earlier, one's culture can be a component, especially in regard to collectivism and individualism. Summarizing just a little further here, you see, another concept or perspective might be sex and gender, as well as social neuroscience and brain activity. That is a very important component. And at the bottom here, I said positive psychology and its focus on what makes people happy and optimistic and engage in moral behavior or interaction. And that concludes this video. Thank you very much.